Hey everyone, it's Sarah, and I am back to film my reading journal for the month of August. So diving straight in, I read every day in the month of August. I read more near the end of the month. I was just finishing up some books. I had a couple of books that I just couldn't set down. So definitely had some good days reading near the end of the month, but still read every day in the month, which has been my kind of habit for the year, which I have been enjoying. So then moving into what I read 7 books total, 2,484 pages, and my favorite book was Crown of Midnight. Then looking at when I started and finished things, obviously I did a lot more reading in the second half of the month than I did the first, but I was also traveling in the first part of the month, so that could be part of it as well. Then looking at what types of books I read, I mainly read the audiobook version of books. I did have a couple of Kindle books, and then I had one physical book that I marked it in my July reading, even though I technically finished it in August 1st, but it was just because I was really tired and I couldn't stay up late reading it, so I read it like first thing in the morning on August 1st to finish it and then count it towards July. Then I had my list of books that I was working on, and this month I actually finished everything that I had started. So I started September totally fresh, hadn't been in the middle of any books, which is refreshing. I pulled a quote from Like Mother, Like Daughter. Once she was born, I was never not afraid. I technically didn't get any bingos completed. I'm still working on finishing up a few of my monthly challenges that I'm behind on. So I had that as a goal or a priority for the month, and I did make progress on it. I just didn't finish it. So kind of a half finished goal. But I did read each day, and I read a book of the month that has been on my shelf for a while. Looking at my Goodreads tracker, again, it was mostly audiobooks this month, but I did have a couple of Kindle books in there too. Stacking up against other months, I was pretty much in the middle. 7 books is a good middle number in terms of other months and what I've read. Then looking at my reading tracker, I just colored in the books for August in this purple color. And then I already have finished 50 books, and I'm actually at 59 books for the year. So getting closer to the 100 goal. I don't know if I'll make it or not, but we'll find out. And then looking at what I read this month, the first book that I read was Dope Sick. And this has been on my list for a while. This was actually one of my 25 and 25 books that I wanted to read this year. And it interested me because it was about the opioid crisis and, working in healthcare, working in pharmacy. It's something that I deal with a lot or see a lot. And so I thought the topic itself was very interesting. I didn't love the book, however. I listened to it as an audiobook, and I'll say I didn't love the audiobook. The narrator is the author, and I just didn't think that she was very... And nonfiction too can also not be the most compelling thing to listen to as an audiobook, but I just didn't think that she was very engaging as a narrator. And there were times when she would stumble over reading something, and one example, she stumbled over something, stopped, and then restarted the sentence, which I just thought was odd that they didn't edit out. And so I don't know, it just didn't feel like a great audiobook in general. I did buy the book, so I do have the book on my shelf, but again, it's been easier for me to listen to the audiobook version of things with taking care of my daughter and you know, things of that nature. Driving, we had a lot of times that we were driving on road trips during the summer, or, you know, driving to the cabin, etc. So the audiobook is just beneficial in that way, but I wouldn't recommend, if you really want to pick up this book, to pick up the audiobook version, if that makes sense. So anyways, it centers around Virginia and the opioid crisis, the opioid addiction. It touches more briefly than I thought it would, especially considering the title of it. They talk about OxyContin and Purdue Pharma, but I just felt like that was left unfinished, or I didn't feel satisfied with where that ended up. There were a lot of different storylines of individual patients or their family that they've left behind since they've since passed away from addiction that, I don't know, just didn't feel as compelling to me, or it just, they all started to blur together, like there were too many stories going on. I didn't think some of the facts were as backed up. Like there was one fact, and I can't even remember it now, but it was essentially just, oh, this pharmacist, you know, told me this, you know, percentage of patients, I don't know, again, I can't remember it, but it just felt like a statistic that was just pulled out of thin air, and it was just like some random pharmacist she talked to had this statistic, and like I said, I don't think that it was an actual, you know, scientifically based statistic. And I think there are plenty of scientifically based statistics that could have been included. So I just struggled with it in terms of, you know, there were things that I liked and there were things that I didn't like. And also too, this is a few years old now. It was published in 2018. And so obviously 7 years later, a lot has changed, or there's more recent data or things like that, that could also be included, or, you know, just kind of changes a little bit of where things were left in the book. So I don't know, it didn't hit all the points that I wanted it to, or it didn't hit in the way that I thought it would. I gave it 3 stars, but I don't know. I've seen other reviews that were less that I can also agree with. But I think overall, you know, I appreciate the topic. I don't know that it was executed in the best way, if that makes sense. Next up is a book that I really didn't like, and this is a new book this year. Ashley Winstead wrote it, and I've read other Ashley Winstead books that I enjoyed, but this is definitely my least favorite out of hers so far that I've read. This is called This Book Will Bury Me, and it's very, very heavily based on the University of Idaho murders that happened just a few years ago, and it felt a little bit too soon for this book, especially with how heavily like copy pasted some of the details were. So it just felt a little icky, especially too because, I mean, just this summer was the trial for the murderer, and again, it felt too soon for this book. I think there's a difference between like taking inspiration from something versus just like a complete, like I said, copy paste, and this felt like very heavily copy paste with like a few details edited at the end to make it slightly different, if that makes sense. So anyways, you have Jane as the main character. She's dealing a lot with grief because her father passed away. She drops out of school, she moves back home, and kind of in her grief-driven state, she ends up getting on these like online sleuth detective kind of chat rooms, and she ends up getting in with a group that likes to, you know, kind of solve crimes from behind their computer. And, you know, the first half of the story is just kind of her being sad and her, you know, getting to know these people online, which I found really boring, to be perfectly honest. And then they eventually, as a group, decide to go to Idaho after these murders happen to try to solve things in person. And that was where I felt like the story picked up more, like it was more exciting to read. But ultimately, I just, in general, was just trying to get through it just to get through it. I probably could have DNF'd this one. I just really don't like to DNF books. And so, yeah, my main complaints are that it was just too on the nose. And then even things that were changed, like descriptions of the town the school is set in, or descriptions of the school, I think were just, like, it was hard to know if the author was taking creative liberties or if she just didn't do research into that part of the story. Because, like, I grew up in Idaho, so I've been to the University of Idaho, Moscow before, and even though she changes the name and changes the name of the school, you know, some of the, like, descriptors of the school and, like, how rich the student population is and how rich the students were and stuff, like, it just felt not realistic for how much was copy and pasted from the real murders, if that makes sense. So it was just hard because, like, those things bothered me. Like, it bothered me how much was copied and pasted, but then some of the creative liberties or deviations also felt wrong to me just because there was so much that was copied and pasted, if that makes sense. So I just didn't like this one. I just felt like it was icky. It just made me feel icky to read about it, because it just felt like you were, you know, capitalizing off of someone's, like, real case, especially when it's literally has just happened in, you know, I don't even remember what year it was, 2022, like within the last 4 years, I believe, maybe even less than that. It just feels wrong to write a story, like I said, literally, you know, copied and pasted in some details. So anyways, I could just keep going on and on about that, but I just didn't like it. Ultimately, could have gone 1 star, could have gone 2, but I settled on 2. Next I have The Senator's Wife, and The Senator's Wife, it starts off, you have Sloane and Robert. Robert's a senator, and then you have Whit and Peg, and Whit is the senator, and they are really closely connected because Robert and Peg are cousins, and so they spend a lot of time with one another. You know, the two couples spend a lot of time with one another, and Robert and Peg die, and it's 2 years later. Sloane and Whit have remarried each other, and, you know, that's kind of where the story picks up. Sloane is kind of the leader or a large part of a foundation, a charitable foundation. So she has a lot of work that she does with that and with managing, you know, kind of charitable wealth and things within this foundation. So she's very busy. She has a whole life and, you know, career, so to speak, of her own. And then you have Whit, who's a senator. So obviously, you know, they are very involved in the Washington scene, politically, socially, etc. And Sloane has lupus. She needs a hip replacement, and so they decide to hire a, like, live-in caretaker to help her, you know, recover after her surgery and continue her work with her foundation. So this person is going to be a nurse / secretary, and, you know, things happen and things that are kind of weird are happening, and, you know, Sloane's health starts deteriorating, and so you're trying to figure out exactly, like, if everyone is who they say they are, if everyone is, you know, telling the truth, if they're being honest with themselves and with others and their motivations, and, you know, trying to figure out exactly what's going on with Sloane and, you know, why she's getting sicker, if it's just a flare of her lupus, if it's something more nefarious going on. So I'll leave it like that, but I gave it 3 stars. I thought it was fine. There were things that I guessed and there were things that I didn't guess, so I felt like it was, you know, a decent mix. But all in all, I enjoyed reading it. I wanted to know more, so 3 stars felt appropriate. Next, I had Big Dumb Eyes. This is a, you know, kind of comedy memoir from Nate Bargatze, and I've definitely, you know, enjoyed watching some of his comedy skits in the past, and so I figured this would be a fun one to pick up. I often like comedian written stories just because they're funny, especially as an audiobook. They oftentimes narrate it, which he does in this case. So I think that, you know, the comedic timing is how they anticipate it or how they envision it, how they wrote it, because obviously they're the ones telling the story. But this one just didn't hit in the way that I expected. There were some stories that were really funny and I really enjoyed them. And then there were a lot of kind of forgettable, not as funny stories too. And so, I don't know, so I gave it 3 stars. I kind of gave it just a middle of the road. I had higher hopes, I suppose. And, you know, like I said, there were some that were funny, really funny, and then there were some that were just, I don't know, a little stupid or a little dumb in my mind. So, you know, all in all, it was fine, but I don't think that, you know, unless you're a big Nate Bargatze like fan, you probably don't need to pick it up. Then I had Like Mother Like Daughter, and this follows Kat and Cleo. Kat is the mother, Cleo is the daughter. They've had some bits of contention and they're, you know, kind of in an argument right now, but Kat invites Cleo over for dinner to try to talk some things out. And when Cleo arrives, the dinner's burning, her mother's nowhere to be found, and then she finds some blood in a bloody shoe or something like that. And so she calls the cops to try to figure out what happened to her mom. And then the story goes back and forth between Kat's point of view before the disappearance and then Cleo's point of view after the disappearance to try to solve what happened. I enjoyed this one. I thought that there were a lot of different possibilities introduced. You know, Kat's a lawyer. Cleo has an ex-boyfriend who is like a drug dealer. And so, you know, there were lots of different, you know, people that could have been behind the disappearance or that could have contributed to the disappearance. And so I appreciated kind of all the different storylines taking shape. Kat also has a lot of secrets in her past that her daughter doesn't really know about, so she's trying to uncover some of those as well. And, you know, it kind of had you guessing as to who was going to ultimately be behind the disappearance or what ultimately was going on. And so I gave it 3 stars, not 4, because the ending fell a little flat to me for how much I enjoyed leading up to it and how much I didn't want to stop reading it. The ending just felt a little lackluster, but I still enjoyed it overall. I just think that the ending didn't, missed the mark a little bit. Next, I have All Night Pharmacy, and I don't even know quite how to describe this book. You have 2 sisters. You have the unnamed narrator or the unnamed main character, and then her older sister Debbie. And the unnamed narrator has, you know, kind of a good future planned out. Like, she's going to go to college and, you know, do something with her life. Her sister, you know, starts taking her out to the bars, and she starts taking, you know, getting her into drugs and, you know, especially prescription drug abuse. And so then, you know, this is the unnamed sister, the main character, never enrolls in college, and, you know, obviously her life kind of takes a different turn. And the book, you know, it essentially just kind of follows the sisters, and I don't know, just kind of their story, like who they're involved with, you know, the drug abuse, how it affects their, you know, other relationships, the different people that they interact with. And I think if you read the back of the book, it almost gives too much of the plot away. And I will say, this isn't a super heavy plot. You just are kind of following these characters in kind of the situations their lives lead. And I will say that, you know, like if you read the back of the book, there's things on the back of the book that didn't come up until, you know, halfway through the book or further. So I feel like it almost gave too much away. But I enjoyed this one. It was just not a book that I think everyone would enjoy. There's a lot of, you know, just kind of letting the story take you, reading on the vibes alone. And again, there's not a lot of plot necessarily in terms of, I don't know, A leads to B leads to C, and, you know, we conclude at D. There's a lot of, you know, fuzziness and whatnot, but I enjoyed it. It was kind of a fun time. I found it interesting at the end of the book. I read the author bio, and she's a pharmacist, so again, it was, you know, kind of a fun, from my perspective, reading a book that, even though it's not really a pharmacy, as the title would suggest, it's more of like an illicit drug use. A lot of the notations or the information about the drugs they're abusing are factual because, you know, a pharmacist wrote the book. So I could appreciate those details as well. So 4 stars. I enjoyed it, but again, I don't think that everyone would enjoy this. But I had a good time with it. And then the last book that I read was Crown of Midnight. This is the second book in the Throne of Glass series. I finally got my audiobook hold for it, which helped me read through it a lot faster than I did the first Throne of Glass series, Throne of Glass book. And so I really enjoyed it. I thought that this one was good. I don't want to say too much about the plot because obviously it's a sequel. I find it hard to talk about series because if I tell you too much about book 2, then it'll spoil things in book 1, etc. But I enjoyed this one. I thought it was really good. I'm on to book 3 as I'm, you know, reading this or recording this in September, and so far I'm really enjoying the series. It took me, the book 1 was okay, but I feel like book 2 and 3, you know, are really driving the plot more and making me want to know what happens next, if that makes sense. So anyways, that was everything I read in the month of August. 7 books total, which is not too bad. And I will be back again in a few weeks to film my reading journal for September. But I hope you enjoyed watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.